Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with me, Mr. Snyder. And today we finish up the 1970s talking about Ford and Carter and their foreign policies. The learning targets for today will compare the foreign policies of Ford and Carter towards the Soviet Union, because they are a little bit different. We'll discuss changing U.S. foreign policy in the developing world, and we will discuss and identify the successes and failures of Carter's policy in the Middle East. So, Ford. Let's talk Ford. Ford continues to pursue détente. It's basically Nixon, where Nixon left off, he's going to continue on. Ford and Brezhnev meet and sign the Helsinki Accords. And the Helsinki Accords basically says we're going to put human rights at the forefront. You know, we're going to base our foreign policy off of how countries treat their citizens. If they're poor to their citizens, we're not going to deal with them. But Ford, although he signs this, it's really not enforced, and he definitely put arms control ahead of human rights. So if you want to write something down, write Ford equals arms control. And that's why he ends up trying to push through a different or a stronger treaty, the SALT II. And the SALT II talks are the disarmament talks between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we initially agree to limit nuclear production. Ford was also criticized for not interfering in Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War, because there are plenty of human rights violations going on there, and they choose not to interfere, and millions upon millions of people are killed in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Carter is the opposite. He is known as our human rights president. He focuses his foreign policy on human rights. So if you want to write down Carter equals human rights, you certainly can. And he basically, if a country is not good to their citizens, then we're not going to deal with them. That's what Carter says. While Carter becomes president, the SALT II treaty is bitterly being debated in the Senate, and some people want to pass it, some people don't. But at the same time, this world event happens that kind of involves us as well. But the Soviets invade Afghanistan to put down a rebellion there. And Carter responds with what are called sanctions. You might have heard that recently, the United States putting sanctions on Russia, again, because of their actions in the Ukraine. These are basically economic penalties against a country. And it also includes a boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. The U.S. doesn't attend. We don't compete. And then as to get back at us, the Soviets don't attend the 1984 Summer Games in Los Angeles. So Carter is upset that the Soviets invade Afghanistan. He refuses to fight for the treaty, and SALT II is never ratified by the United States. So we don't have to abide by it. Carter feels that, again, foreign policy towards the developing world should include human rights. And the U.S. relationships, he feels, towards other countries should be based on how it treats our citizens. For example, he withdraws our support for Nicaragua because their dictator is found to have been brutal towards its citizens. Without our support, the Nicaraguan government falls and the Sandinistas come to power, and that will come back to haunt us in the 1980s. So let's just review Carter versus Ford. Ford doesn't stray very far from Nixon's foreign policy. He still wants détente. He thinks human rights are important, but he wants armed control more. Carter shifts from fighting communism to supporting human rights around the globe and stops pursuing détente and imposes sanctions on the USSR, basically bringing an end to the détente era. Just a little side lesson here about the Soviet-Afghan War and how our interests in Afghanistan affects us today. So the Soviet-Afghan War lasts for 10 years, and Afghanistan is a Soviet state. They're run by a pro-Soviet government, but the Muslims there are not happy about this, so a rebel group is intent on overthrowing the government. So Soviets obviously respond to this, and they send in troops and tanks and military to crush the rebellion. But the Soviets have far superior weaponry, so why does it take so long? The rebels fight using their knowledge of the mountainous terrain and guerrilla tactics. And that should sound familiar because it's how the Vietnamese fought against the United States. So after 10 years and thousands of casualties and an embarrassing defeat, the Soviets pull out of Afghanistan in 1989. And then rival Muslim groups fight for power until a group called the Taliban takes over and begins imposing harsh rule on its citizens. So during this war, we see a opportunity to undermine Russia. And so our CIA operatives supply the weapons, or the rebels, with weapons and training. Years later, one of those rebels was a man by the name of Osama bin Laden, and he and his followers turn on the United States, and they use those weapons and terrorist tactics against the United States. And here are some terrorist attacks in the 1990s that stem straight from this event. The first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, or the Twin Tower bombings, the USS Embassy bombings in Africa in 1998, the Cole, the ship, naval ship, is attacked in Yemen, and a suicide bomber blows a hole in the side of that boat. And finally, the September 11th attacks of 2001. So again, we'll get into this later in our studies, but I just wanted to bring it up now since it's happening right now. Carter ends détente over this war. So Israel and Egypt finally agree to peace. These two countries fought in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and that was their fourth war in 25 years. This is an Arab-Jewish problem and disagreement. So the leaders of the two countries meet to try to improve relations, and they meet in Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. And it takes about 2 weeks, but finally the three leaders sign the Camp David Accords. And what this is it's the first step in a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. So Egypt formally recognizes Israel as a nation, as an official country, just like we did to China earlier this chapter. They're the first Arab nation to do that. And in response to that, Israel removes its troops from a territory of Egypt that it had occupied since the Yom Kippur War. So the Camp David Accords earn Carter a Nobel Peace Prize. But then we get to the negative in his his Middle Eastern policy, and that's the Iranian hostage crisis. It lasts for 444 days. So over a year, these people are held hostage. What is it? It's a crisis between Iran and the United States where 52 U.S. diplomats or representatives of the United States in Iran are held hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Iran. And so going back on our history with Iran, we kind of talked about this when the CIA was started after World War II, but Eisenhower uses it to overthrow foreign governments that aren't friendly to the United States. So we put a U.S.-backed Shah of Iran, and that's his name. He has a real name, but he's known as the Shah of Iran, into power. And so this foreign intervention into Iranian affairs unites opposition against the Shah. The Shah lives in luxury while his people are starving. He westernizes Iran, which makes these people hate the West even more. And he exiles, or he throws out of the country, the opposition leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, in 1964. And then during the Iranian Revolution, during the late 70s, the Shah's regime falls. He goes into exile. Ayatollah Khomeini comes back and becomes the new leader of the new government in Iran. And the Shah then becomes ill, and since we're the ones that put him into power and he's our friend, we allow him to come to the Mayo Clinic for treatment for cancer. And this infuriates Iranians, and they protest. And then finally in November of 1979, 300 to 500 young Iranian students overrun the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and capture 66 hostages. They release some, and they hold 52 until January of 1981. Carter, we don't deal with terrorists, so he refuses these Iranian demands and even attempts a rescue operation, which is botched, and we can't even rescue these people. And so Ayatollah Khomeini claims it's divine intervention and that the United States is wrong, and it even furthers anti-Western or anti-U.S. sentiment in Iran. So the final months of this, the Shah dies. Iran has new things to deal with when it's invaded by Iraq in 1980. The United States negotiates for the hostages to be released even after Carter loses the election in 1980. Finally, just as kind of a stick to the face of Carter, the hostages are released minutes after President Reagan is sworn into office as president, and they spent 444 days in captivity. They get a hero's welcome when they get back to America. They have a ticker tape parade in New York, and in a showy or classy show of class, the Major League Baseball gives these people lifetime passes to any minor or Major League Baseball game. And so for their time, they get free baseball. And it's something small, but it's something. And that is the Iranian hostage crisis. It's an embarrassment for Carter, and it basically is what people remember about his administration. It's some of the photos in their mind. And so that's all your learning targets. Fill those out, and I'll talk to you later in class. Bye-bye.